I'm Kristof from Tomme, and welcome to the API Resilience podcast. If you've ever wondered what it really is we do when we do APIs, and if you've wondered how APIs change organizations, our communities, and our society, look no further. This is the podcast you've been searching for. Welcome to the API Resilience podcast. I'm super excited because today I've got Marsh Gardiner as a guest. Marsh recently left Google after 14 years as a product manager for Apigee. And that's how we go way back from the early days of when we started doing API documentation. And Marsh is an active contributor to a bunch of open source projects, including the OpenAPI and the original Swagger editor. And most recently, he's been a part of the CNCF's platforms working group that published a well-received platform engineering maturity model last fall. He's also a maintainer for AEP.dev, an early effort to establish good API design patterns modeled off Google's AIPs. Welcome, Marsh. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Kristof. It's great to be here.
We decided to do this after we had like a whole long brainstorming session together. And we were like, we have to make a recording of this because there's a lot of really interesting nuggets that we want to share with the wider world.
Yeah, I mean, it came out of the grassroots effort that Matthew Reinbold led, API Futures. We all see the possibilities a little bit differently, and we don't do enough to sort of think about how to get these ideas out in the world. And it fits right into my worldview. Like, I think what holds back the next generation of API management is having the language and the thinking that lives in our heads in different ways, and we communicate it better and we try. So what I love about the API Futures effort is that it got a lot of people. I think there were maybe between 20 and 40 published posts in the end, and I think they're still coming in. And one of the most fun things for me about that was that you and I saw a really similar problem, but we came at it from different angles. And then when we talked about it, we found that it was pretty much the same problem. We just had different ways of explaining it.
I think we still haven't really truly settled like are APIs now utilities or what is it?
But, right. Yeah. Actually, explain that, and then I'll give you my version, and we can help people understand how we got to the same spot.
Let's kick it off there. So I love the commentary you wrote about my post, where you said that a fiery post about API products. It's something that I've been banging my head on this problem for 3 years now. I got to know Worley mapping 3 years ago. And for people listening, I think I've mentioned Worley mapping already a few times. But if you don't know it, go and look it up. It's super cool. It's like a way to predict the future of technologies, basically. It's a tool where you're mapping how technologies evolve against where they are in the value chain. One of the key features of Worley mapping is that there is a transition from product to commodity and between brackets plus utilities. So I've been banging my head on this because I'm like, everybody in the API communities keeps on talking about APIs are products and you should really treat APIs as products because it's a bad idea, to treat them as projects, which totally makes sense. But then if this Worley mapping is kind of predicting that this is an intermediary state and there actually APIs need to evolve into utilities. And then I started talking to people about this, and then I got really mixed reactions because some people, they get kind of defensive because like, please don't start talking about utilities because my boss is just going to defund my program because utility sounds like commodities and there's no money there. And that's why I wrote this fiery blog post about APIs are interface utilities. And actually, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing because you can still make products with them. But that was the thing. And then you wrote this other post, which was coming from another angle. Well, can you tell your story?
Yeah. So look, APIs are programming interfaces, full stop. So whether an API, all API products have that underneath them. So my point was that all APIs have this fundamental technical contract underneath that solves a technical problem, and that some APIs are productized. And I gave a definition of what that is. So for me, when you begin to invite users to use this technical contract, you are taking on a social contract. You're saying, hey, this is safe for you to use. solves a problem you probably have, and I'm not going to break you. If you build on top of this, you can trust that I'm going to keep delivering. And to me, that's the change between this purely technical contract to this socio-technical object by wrapping it in that social contract. And so what I think is similar between the things we're both saying is that, look, at their base, they're a common thing. APIs are this technical utility. They're bringing value in some way. A utility does work. The question is, are you willing to take on the social obligation? And I think that's what, if I had to guess, how did you arrive at your point of view? It would be that, because I hear something over and over again, which is that engineers don't always want the obligation of treating an API like a product. That seems like overhead, and do I really need to do it? And I think the answer is no, you don't. Like, just be mindful of the social obligation. Don't let other people use your API if they're outside your team, if you aren't willing to take on that responsibility.
That is an interesting piece. After our conversation, I made a whole slide deck about this stuff. So, and one of the slides, so I have got a slide that's talking about different layers of agreements. So there's the social agreement, which is like the affordances of this thing that you have. There's the design agreements of how this API is designed and how you should do calls and so on. And then there's the infrastructure agreement that is about what are our SLAs, how much are you going to pay me? I'm not sure if that fits with the infrastructure, the payment part, but what are the rules of you using this thing, and how are you not going to blow up my servers? Now, I think, but this is an interesting question, because are APIs evolving from projects to products to utility? Or how do you see this?
Okay, well, interesting, because when you were talking about Worley mapping, I was wondering, it sounded as if there was a journey where products become commodities over time. And what was interesting about that is that I think with the framing of utility, APIs as utility that you put in your blog post, it felt like we were starting with the commodity at that point. And so the journey, when does it become a product on that journey is what I was left questioning.
So normally what happens in a Worley map is that as things move to the right, as things become more commodity-like, new layers emerge on top of them that are closer to the customers, that are not commodities. So typically what you'll see is that you got technologies moving, like cloud computing. Like right now, companies don't buy server farms anymore. They just buy a couple of hours of, whatever capacity they need of cloud computing that has truly become a networked utility. Also, I was thinking a lot about this, about what is my definition of a utility. A commodity is a commoditized technology. It's a ubiquitous technology. It's not necessarily commodity in the economical sense, because I think that's where there's a lot of confusion, because commodities in an economical sense is like, it's so commoditized that there's no margins anymore, so you shouldn't be in this business. That's kind of like what people normally think when they hear commodity and also utility. But then my definition of utility is a networked, ubiquitous technology. So it's a networked, ubiquitous technology that has a network effect. I heard this story on the Acquired podcast about how Visa grew up. And actually, and this is really, really crazy, but if you start digging, most true utilities are gold mines. They're not places of economical despair. They're actually places where there's a whole lot of money being made. The utilities, like the electricity plants, those are the things that pension funds are investing in, because they're a really reliable source of revenue. Similarly, Visa, they have a 50% margin in their business, which is crazy.
But in both of those cases, I think both of those, electricity and Visa and telcos, those all benefit from network effect. There is a drive towards a monopoly power, and that is and that's why it attracts so much regulation.
Yes,
because it's really easy to keep extracting value from that rather than keeping it efficient and benefiting society as much as it needs to grow to.
There is some regulatory dance that has to be played, but there's so much value that's being unlocked in those services.
When I wrote the post for the API Futures piece, what was really bugging me is that we generally, in the API management space, when we say API products, most of the time, we're talking about externalized API products. How do you enable partners? How do you enable innovation on top of the service that you've built or to support a product that you have? I don't disagree with that. There are some famous products, Twilio, Stripe, that are really API focused. Those are true API products. But that doesn't mean they're the only ones. They're just like one extreme. What's an anti-pattern? An anti-pattern would be if you're a large enough organization, you probably have a number of people building services that look pretty similar. In fact, they could be substitutes for each other. I remember one large enterprise in the telco space was looking through the APIs they had and realized they had 37 different location APIs. And then I think actually over time that I worked with them, the number kept going up because if you, of course, if you find 37, you're going to find a 38th or probably a 39th in it, and someone's going to build a 40th. And that's just bonkers to me. It seems inefficient. Why does it happen? It happens because you've reached a certain size where it's just easier for people to start creating another solution to the same problem. Or maybe it's because they weren't aware because you haven't collected all that information in one place. Maybe there are good reasons for it. Maybe there are regulatory reasons why things have to be different, or even the organizational hierarchy. Like it can be difficult to use APIs from other parts of the business because it's not built to work together. It can be done, but it's just, you got to solve some political problems too. And what was frustrating me is that we don't have a way to talk about these things that aren't monetized directly. So if I have this location API and I want to offer it to other teams to use, that's an efficiency, right? Why should we be paying to solve this problem in code again and again and again? We should figure out how to drive collaboration and reuse so that we can focus on other problems and not build 37 location APIs. What does that mean? It means thinking about your API as an internal product. What is a product? A product is, it is often ideally self-serve. So your consumers can discover it and adopt it on their own without you getting in the way. That's how you can scale your users. The product, it needs to solve a problem. It needs to be, something that you can manage that growth with, but that's it. You have to understand who your users are, help them to find and use it, and put the guardrails around to make sure that they don't do something unexpected that takes down your service. And that's a value exchange. So clearly your consumers are getting value from this, but what is the value that the producers are getting in this case? And in an externalized API, you can see that more easily because your partners are doing things that they couldn't do before, or you're directly monetizing your API. Internally, though, it's really about impact, and we don't have ways to measure that today. But this is what's happening. Like when they build on top of your service, you are enabling them. And how do you get the credit for that? I think that's one of the great problems we got to figure out how to deal with.
So, and this is where I think for internal reasons, it might be more useful to think about those APIs as infrastructure than as products. Because if they're treated as infrastructure, so one of the stories I've heard from a large bank was our developers don't use each other's APIs because they don't trust it. When something goes wrong with your service that you're providing to your customers, if you've incorporated somebody else's API and it was their API that messed up, then good luck finding the person who's responsible for that API and getting them to solve your problem. It's just not going to work.
Again, I think we're back to the same point, just different sides of it. Because to me, it's that is the trust. That no one will. One good reason why you might end up with 37 location APIs is because you didn't trust that there was any accountability here. And so I think that's the obligation of thinking about APIs as products, even in an internal case. What grates on me about calling these APIs infrastructure is that infrastructure feels like it emphasizes the technical aspects and de-emphasizes the social aspects. And that's the part that I really want to shine a light on.
I had this from project mindsets to product mindset to infrastructure mindset. When you go from project to product, you're extending your time horizon. You're saying, like in a project, it's like, this is a limited time, and after that time, we're done, and we're closing this thing. Product is, this actually, it has a lifetime. We have to keep investing it, and we have to measure how much value it's creating to keep on investing in it. Infrastructure is saying, this is so important that we're not even going to even consider closing it down, because if we have that as a thought pattern, nobody's going to use this thing. And it's kind of like you cannot start doing e-commerce without a road network. You cannot have bicycles without a road network. All of these things are built on this critical infrastructure that you just cannot live without, because otherwise you're just going to be living in the Stone Age. Alicia Guerrero, she's this awesome, super smart person who wrote this book, Context Changes Everything. And she's talking about how enabling constraints evolve to become governing constraints. And it's this idea that you get standardization of certain things. And then once these constraints start standardizing, they become so important for your ecosystem that the ecosystem cannot survive without it when they become actually a governing constraint. And they get baked into the fabric of this ecosystem that's evolving. This is this evolution from something we're just experimenting here and it can blow up anytime, so please use at your own risk, to this is a product, I'm going to charge you for it, but it's enabling you to do stuff too. This is so critical that we're not even considering this ever going away. That's what I'm seeing with the utility aspect.
Okay, so I want to come back to what you were the dichotomy you described, project versus product, because I think it's another way of saying what we're both trying to say here, which is that a project is really a purely technical problem. You solve it and you're done. Like I may have a mobile app that needs to talk to a backend service. I'm not planning on anyone else using the APIs that make that happen. That's a project technical orientation. When people, whether you intend it or not, but like when people start to depend on that API because you've invited them to in particular, that's when you need to be taking the product mindset in the longer term view. Here's the challenge of the API space is that APIs today are really expected to be consumed by other engineers. And what is the trap that we as engineers fall into? The things we can control more often are the technical aspects of it. The things that make us less comfortable are the social implications. And this is part of the reason why API management has been so fixated on gateways for the first 15-ish years of its existence. It's the gateways are a thing we understand. That there are hard technical problems you can solve there, but it's to some degree distracted us from solving these problems of the socio-technical aspects of this. How do you know if you can trust them? Like that, to me, when you talk about roads enabling bicycles or cars, having that social contract and that level of trust fits into that kind of like what's necessary for the system to thrive. You talked about the way you were thinking of things, affordance design and infra.
Yes.
I have a similar way of thinking about it. When I talk about the technical contract, I'm talking about the functional description of that service. How is it that people can call your API? What are they going to get when they do? And then on top of that are a bunch of, let's call those the functional entitlements. And then on top of the functional entitlements are non-functional entitlements. You can call this API 100 times an hour, 1,000 times an hour, or this is the cost per request, or how the pricing breaks down, or what your response time, what our uptime is going to be, or what your even things that seem way outside the technical contract, like if you have a problem, what is the time to resolution that you can expect it to be solved in? Will people get out of bed to fix your problem? And so to me, that like the functional and the non-functional, and then the sort of infrastructure world for me would be more like, how is it that your organization has standardization? What gateways are blessed inside this organization? What are the expected processes that you will know that things like security have been handled properly because you followed the standards?
Interesting. Because I would still add another layer, which is exactly the social layer, which is what do people expect to be able to do with your product? And that expectation is something that's a cultural thing. Today, developers expect that a company has APIs and that they can go look to a developer portal to find the APIs. But if you don't know about APIs, if you don't know this pattern, if you're not aware of how the world works, you don't know about this and you don't know where to go look for it. You gave me a really interesting insight when we last talked, was that the affordances are being baked into the API design. And that actually a really good API design has an API design where you're making it obvious for a developer to understand what you can do with the API. And that really got me. I was really thinking about that because there's the three economies model from Jay Bloom, and he splits it into these three layers: scope, scale, and differentiation. So, differentiation outward facing, this is where you're interacting with the markets to make it clear for people what they can do with your product and why they should buy your product, and to shape the market and the expectation that something exists that can help you with this problem in this way. There's the scope, which is where these two domains mix. So there's the scale, which is all about how can we do this really cheaply and how can we reduce variability so that it becomes cheaper to do this thing. And then there's the scope where these two things mix with each other, and where you have the platform, which is about making things that become better from reuse. And the more people
Mhm.
that reuse it, these are kind of intertwined and it's kind of messy. Yeah.
Well, so you got me thinking when you were explaining the three economies last time we talked. Because how do I see this manifesting inside of organizations? Because the thing I began with when I was approaching this was differentiation makes sense for external API products. That's a competitive marketplace. Lots of entrants can come in, and everyone is competing for the developers who are today, but also for the more developers we can expect tomorrow. And so differentiation there seemed easy. But then a question I asked was where do you see this internally? I tried to apply this. Correct me because I'm new to the three economies model. To me, differentiation is the services that different engineering teams might be building. They're working on their own little corner of the world, solving the problems that they have organizational buy-in to solve. So every one of them is doing something that's ideally differentiated, or if it's not, you get 37 location APIs. What's the commodity piece here? What is the utility aspect is that all of these applications run on similar environments, whether that's they're having a similar software development lifecycle, but more importantly, like you need databases, you need compute, you need storage. And so where for me, the scope aspect, that middle economy comes, is it is enabling the differentiation by handling the journey from this differentiated service authoring to deploying and running it on top of commodity infrastructure. And the platform that does that makes those journeys repeatable and easy and consistent, that is an example of an economy of scope. What's interesting about this is that your addressable market is the other teams inside your organization. That's it. If the organization grows, it'll get bigger, but your market is pretty defined by that.
Actually, and here's with open source, that's no longer the case. Because then, and this is actually what is happening, is that these platforms are socialized outside of your own organization. There's some differentiated platform bits. There's some bits that you want to be your company specific, but there's a whole bunch of bits that you want to be, throughout the whole ecosystem. Because then you can together maintain this thing and have things that plug into it. The reason why Spotify funded Backstage, because they didn't want to end up in an API ecosystem where suddenly they had to go and replace their developer portal because now somebody had built something that everybody's integrating with that was not their thing.
Yes. So what I think this is a natural response, and it takes time for these things to evolve. I should first declare my own blind spot and bias here. I came to platform engineering when I came across a working group in the CNCF, the platforms working group. And the CNCF is really... Kubernetes is the big thing there, right? And what is it? So what does Kubernetes do? It gives you a way in which to deal with how to deploy applications, regardless of what hardware you happen to be running on. It could be on-prem, it could be in a public cloud. It gives you a way in which to deliver those applications. But Kubernetes is huge and powerful and kind of amazing, but really complicated. And if you're going to ask all of your engineering teams to understand how Kubernetes works, you've got an education problem, and this is just going to slow you down. And so to me, I think platform engineering is a kind of natural response to simplifying the complexity of Kubernetes and creating these reusable patterns over and over again. And it would be absurd to do that inside your any company's walls. These are common problems that everyone's going to have.
Yeah.
And so I think there is a kind of natural open sourcing of this. But on the flip side, every company I've ever seen has a different development culture. These are all organically grown, learning what works for them. It's intertwined with the culture of the organization. And so at some point, you have to figure out how to take these commodity solutions and fit them to your own needs. And I think that's the opportunity for this kind of economy of scope. And some of it, I think, is going to feel the pressure of open source because it, like Backstage, it makes no sense to solve this over and over again. The same thing I was saying about the 37 location APIs, it works when talking across companies, and what enables them to connect and collaborate, I think, is really open source. I think it's exciting.
I think that the real question is, the really, really hard question is, where should you compete and where should you collaborate?
Yeah, yes.
That's the real question. And that is for all APIs, that is the real crux of the problem. Right now, with the current limited API product thinking, we're all competing on developer experience. We're all trying to make the magical API design that's going to be better than everybody else's API design. And it's ridiculous.
It is. And you start to see things like copying. Like when Stripe came out, it was revelatory because they had done such a great job thinking about the design of their API and making it approachable and understand. They considered the affordances necessary for adoption. And then within a couple of years, PayPal came along and essentially copied a lot of the principles that made that work. Stripe discovered something that was pretty great. Discovered it. Maybe that's an interesting way to put it. I mean, they designed it carefully.
They designed it.
Discovered like the artist discovers the statue in a block of marble. Discovered.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I meant, right? It's the same. There's an artistry to it. On the one hand, part of me was like, "Oh, come on, PayPal, you just copied what Stripe did, really?" And on the other hand, it was like, "Well, it makes sense. Why wouldn't you? Someone's like recognized a pattern, and it should be perpetuated."
And actually, it makes it better. Because the more people follow the same pattern, the more people understand it, the easier it becomes to utilize your version of that pattern. And this is classical economy of scope. It's like the more people use it, the only issue is that there's a limited window of time where having a differentiated API design helps you to build a counterposition to the rest of the industry that actually gives you competitive advantage. But that window closes. And this is actually what's happening to Twilio and to Stripe. Is that there's now a lot more competition happening, and now they all having their own API design is not all that sensible anymore. It's kind of like a world where every bank has their own credit card scheme, and they're trying to do some crazy magic with checks and stuff, like the pre-Visa era. Basically, that's where we are right now with APIs.
Look, the substitutability. Like if your APIs are simpler, this makes it easier to switch providers, and that's losing that edge of competitive advantage. What I think it still remains, though, and I'm curious to see how Twilio and Stripe survive this as they grow. You can copy someone's interface, but you can't copy the process that got you to that point.
Also, the reliability, the processes that you've got in the background, so that this initial advantage of better developer experience needs to morph into something else. Ideally, have a scale effect or a scale and network effects, although they don't have scale effects because they're just repackaging the services from the telcos. They don't own the wavelength. They're just a thin layer on top of it.
Trust, reliability, long-term performance and history, like these are things that become hard to compete with. Like what's to say that the company that builds an API that looks a lot like Stripe is going to be there tomorrow or is going to be so committed to this space? Like, I think you have a chance to build your reputation, and that to some degree is your network effect.
There is a brand. There's definitely a brand's power that you can build. I think that the real network effect that you can build is when you have an ecosystem of derivative interfaces that have been built on top of what you've done that enable non-developer usage of your APIs. That is, I think, where the real value lies in these tools.
There's another aspect, too, that's worth mentioning, which is the similarity. Like, are there other complementary services that extend this same pattern into other business domains? Is another way in which to capture attention, because better together can happen down that path, too.
Yeah, well, this is what we've been doing. They've been adding message, like email sending and a bunch of other stuff. This is already happening. They're basically becoming a notifications API. And then there is a network effect because now you have a single API across these different domains that are really divergent. It's not the same players that are providing those services.
Like, how do you describe even what a platform is? Like, it starts to get really messy and squishy here. The Apogee positioned API management as a platform. And I think that was a fair play. But like the difference here between the platform engineering that's emerging around Kubernetes as the solution to application delivery challenges, that's one kind of platform. You can also choose to buy platforms that solve problems. But the challenge here is that you've got to also understand how that's going to fit into your development culture. You can't just solve API management, by itself. You have to understand how that fits into the software development lifecycle. And so the platform, I suspect that one of the things that has held back, or maybe there are two things that have held back the API management platform adoption. One is it's not built necessarily to be accommodated into your developer workflows. And so you've got a lot of work to do to make that happen, make it easy. The second thing is that I think we hadn't seen the organizational structures emerging inside of companies to own these kinds of problems the way they need to be owned. And so I think the platform engineering that's coming out of the need to simplify the journeys for Kubernetes, companies big enough to run Kubernetes, that I think was almost a necessity for large companies to also then figure out how to work in these other paid platforms into their developer journeys. So I've been wondering if this platform engineering emergence is a necessary precondition for us to reach that level of integration.
Coming back to the three economies, I really love Jay Bloom's definition of platforms. It's like things that become better from reuse. So it's not, the more you use them, the more value is being created, which is completely counterintuitive because normally, and this is where it kind of jars with traditional IT, which is all about reducing costs by making things as simple as possible. And then you try to reduce usage. But actually, platforms are about, no, you want to go open source because that means more people will use your thing. And that means it's going to get better because more things will be built on top of that thing.
You pointed out, I think, one of the great dilemmas is that, like, if IT treats, there's some things you want to treat as a cost center, and there are other things you want to treat as a value center. And understanding when to apply which of those lenses is what really becomes important. And so one of the things that historically IT has been about controlling costs.
Yes.
But when you get to things like, how are you going to enable a kind of internal API marketplace that encourages efficiency and reuse, that's about creating value and enabling these kinds of higher level systems to emerge inside your company. And that is not necessarily what IT has been great at.
He argues that there's three ways to run teams: focusing on differentiation and creating value by creating variety and creating different products that capture more value because they make things easier. There's the economy of scale, which is all about reducing variability so that you can reduce costs and really focusing on reducing the cost. And then there's the third way of working, which is really focusing on reuse and just don't care about costs, don't care about differentiation. You're all about reuse. That's your way of creating value. And those are three very different ways of managing a team. Because in the differentiation, you're looking at how much money are we making? How much value are we capturing? The scaling, you're like, how much money are we saving? And then the platform is how much are things being used more and more and more by more and more people? And that just jars. And that's what
and it's tricky with the internal economies because it's not about how much money are you making directly, because these are in support of other monetized products, but internal APIs as products. I don't think the answer is charge back or show back internally. These things are harder to quantify. I think that's one of the challenges we've got to work through.
It's been a little while since I talked with him, but I don't know how organizations handle this. I think that there's like the inner sourcing crowds, and they're trying to do this. There's the open source, of course, the open source world.
Yeah.
But very interesting problems.
One more thought about platform engineering. I have a lot to process in this. Another way to look at what the rise of platform engineering is as a natural evolution of the journey of DevOps. Right? So 10, 12 years ago, the realization was that as long as we keep these two teams isolated, those who are building the software and those who are operating it, we're going to be at a lower efficiency than if we consider the holistic view of what it means to have operational responsibility for the software you build. And so that required this was a change in scope of the different kind of scope, but a change in scope of the role of engineers is that now you had to think about, and some people, developed that kind of specialty. But the important piece is that kind of expertise began to seep into engineering teams. The challenge then becomes that if you have different teams solving these problems in their own ways, you've got inconsistency and wasted effort too. So to me, platform engineering is a way to systematize some of the things we've learned about how to do DevOps in ways that make it easier. It takes some of the burden of the things that are common across teams and centralizes it. It's just, I think, the natural pendulum swinging back and forth between these two things.
When you just started saying this, it made me think about it, that the answer of DevOps felt like bring differentiation and scale together and make them work together. Where what Jape is saying is that actually don't do that. Actually put the third one in the middle.
Yes. But like you don't need the third one until you get to a certain point.
Yes.
And I think that's what we're seeing it. Here's my potentially controversial point of view. I think in the way we saw the role of engineering grow to include ops, which gave us DevOps, I think we can't avoid it. We are on a track with the services we're building to be mindful of what it means to run them as products. If you only ever use it, if you build a service that only solves a technical problem for yourself, great. We're back to the technical orientation, the API to solve a technical problem that we started this with. To me, understand what does an API do? When it gives you a way in which to grow usage. This is the productization story that we were talking about earlier. You build this service to solve a problem. If this service can solve a problem for many more people, how are you going to manage that? Well, the way in which to distribute that service is through an API. The way in which to take on users and turn your service into a product is through an API. And so similar to the way in which we saw ops get smooshed into dev and gave us DevOps, as you are building services to be used by other teams, all engineering teams are going to begin to have to understand a product mindset and how they choose to productize the services they write or not. So where's that going to come from? It's going to come from one of two places. Either we're going to find more product managers who are technical enough to thrive in these situations, or we're going to find engineers who are comfortable with the product implications of the software that they're writing and grow into these roles. I think it's going to look a lot like DevOps. You'll see some specialists, like SREs, I would argue, are kind of specialists in DevOps land. I think we'll see some more product-oriented specialization in engineering, and I think we'll see some people who are wearing both hats.
I think there's another dimension to this problem, and that's maybe an interesting lens to explore with you. So one of my big aha moments was when I realized that as you go to the right in a Worley map, so you go from completely new to custom built to product, there's a barrier between products and utilities. Well, I guess there's also barriers between the other stages, but the barrier between a product and a utility is where you're changing the context from how you're consuming what is being produced, from a context of inside of the product to a network context. The example I've used is a generator, an electricity generator. You can buy a generator and then you have this device that inside of its own context creates electricity. We have done this whole standardization process where this generator is producing standard electricity, like 220 volts, this frequency, blah, blah, blah. But that's kind of like interesting because there was a time when that was not the case, where you had electricity products that were not standardized. Now, but what happened to make electricity utility, there was a standardization that was necessary that meant that the utility of a product, the thing that a product provides, became context-free. Because now you can go anywhere in your house or anywhere to your neighbors, they all have the same electricity. And because it's so standardized, now it does not really matter where you are exactly, because there's a really broad domain that shares the same context for how to use electricity.
Well, I can take my laptop to the coffee shop and plug in there, and if my battery gets low.
Exactly. And this transformation is a really, really big one, because you're going from everybody has their own standard inside of their own products, like API management. All API management solutions have their own API management API, and they have their own ideas about how you do these things, and so on and so on. I think what is actually happening is that with the hyperscalers buying a bunch of API management platforms, they're looking at how do we move beyond this product as a service stage where API management is currently stuck to like a service that is context-free, where you can just spin up a proxy and, there's a bunch of stuff that get lost.
But I think that's the same story as clouds. Any large enterprise is generally in different clouds. And how do you reduce the toil of having all of your engineering teams understand which cloud to use and why? or what services are blessed. Like instead, platform engineering is meant to make this easy. And I think if it doesn't incorporate API management as part of, in the same way that metrics, like you don't want every team rolling their own metrics. You want some standard ways so you can pull this information from across teams into one place, right?
Yeah.
And it gets to something I've been thinking about a lot: governance. Right? It's a word. It's a big, heavy word that I've been starting to make my peace with. It does two things. Governance enables and constrains, right? So governance regulates and sort of controls things. It's what keeps growth from going in unhealthy ways. But it also enables by creating almost a platform, if you will. But let me explain an example. So for instance, if I build a cabin in the middle of nowhere and I want water, I'm going to dig a well. If 1,000 people build cabins near me, or 10,000 people, at some point you hit the number where it becomes really inefficient to keep digging wells for every one of these houses. And in fact, you can get a much better overall efficiency solution when you think about how to make a water main. How do you invest in the infrastructure necessary to make the marginal addition of another cabin or house much lower than having to literally sink that effort into the ground? And this is a collective action problem. How do you recognize at what point you need to systematize? And we're talking real infrastructure here, like the infrastructure to deliver the water. What leadership is required to recognize those opportunities? This feels like a natural governance opportunity, because the challenge here is that with that centralization comes power and responsibility. And you can't, like, because what, now you stop digging wells because everyone's using your water main, but now you can start ratcheting up the water mains, the cost for water, right? And
which
so
is happening.
Yes, it's happening. I mean, that's the centralization of, and this is why privatization of industries that are utilities is scary, and is something that, it's an important problem in governance today. But anyway, that's a really long-winded way of saying what I think we're seeing is the digital infrastructure take shape inside of organizations that are large enough. This doesn't happen in a small organization, by the way. If you're not at, say somewhere between 500 and 1,500 engineers, you shouldn't be standing up your own backstage. You don't have the density or population growth to support that. And so you get to see there's some really interesting patterns that seem to be repeating. Like, how often are we going to learn? These lessons are the same, but they're different too, because digital is different.
In the presentation I did about utilities, we've done this a few times now as humanity, and every time they transformed society. So like, one of the first that I can see is streaming water, as you like water mains that enables sanitation, that basically enables us to build cities.
Yep.
Because without sanitation, you don't want to live there. There's the electricity network, and that is all similar. Money definitely is also a utility. It was a friend of mine who pointed it out. It's like, actually, this is totally utility. APIs are something similar. I wonder, what is the utility? What is it that we're standardizing? And what is it that it's enabling? So I think it's enabling is that we're all becoming magicians. Because now we have these digital interfaces that are all over the place, everywhere around us, and we can do amazingly huge things with a snap of a finger. But I have some ideas of what it is that we're turning into the standardization that is enabling this transformation. But it requires standardization. Without standardization, it's only the large companies that can do this. So what is going to make API something that's even a one-person business can fully utilize?
So, fair point. I think for the largest enterprises, that's absolutely true. For the smaller enterprises, or even small businesses, I think we can also see patterns in large public cloud providers. If you're small engineering shop, you're unlikely to spread yourself across multiple clouds, because what you get by choosing a specific cloud is that they've made an effort to do some of the things that we see with platform engineering. How do you make these journeys easier? How do you make it, if you know how to use one of our services, the other one's going to work somewhat similarly. Billing will be this, you'll understand the billing system. They're just reasons why if you are small enough, choose one cloud. and use the hell out of it, right? And you can essentially defer a bunch of your platform engineering work to living with the opinions that cloud puts upon you.
But what if you can't even afford a developer? Well, because we've been working with a bank, they're working with really small businesses that can't afford development. Like if you have an SME, like 3 employees, 4 employees, that is not in the software business, they cannot afford spending money on developing their custom interfaces and maintaining them, because that is the worst part. How are you going to keep paying for all these security updates and whatever that is happening? To have that long tail of utility that APIs can offer us, to some extent we have it, right? Like we all have smartphones in our pockets, and that is basically providing utility of APIs to the normal person already today. But that adaptability and the open-endedness is still missing. I guess AI is probably going to enable that part.
Yeah. I mean, as you were asking, forming the question, there were 2 things I was thinking of. One is the best example I have is sort of, I remember back when Twitter offered a bunch of JavaScript widgets. Like if you wanted to embed tweets or a feed in your website, you didn't need to understand how to use the Twitter API. You could embed the JavaScript client essentially that you could work into your page. Yeah. That to me is one response, like you were asking about with SMEs. The other exciting one is AI. I want to go back to a point you made because it's something I've been thinking about too, which is magicians. I've always felt like APIs, they always remind me of Neo in the Matrix. Like, I know Kung Fu, or I can fly a chopper, right?
Yeah.
These are suddenly things that you don't have to be an expert in, you can do. That's incredibly empowering. This is what makes me so excited about APIs still after 14 years of just living in that world. So that is magical. The challenge is that we're building magical objects for wizards. What AI, I think, enables, the muggles are coming. It enables people who don't think in terms of writing code to do things that are being facilitated through APIs, but they don't have to understand that level of detail. It's an abstraction on top of it. That's it. That's really amazing.
So everybody becomes a magician.
Everybody becomes a magician. But what bothers me about some of the thinking I hear out in the world is that, like, yep, AI solves this problem. Wash your hands of it, we're done. But actually, it just creates different problems.
Oh, yeah,
because someone still is like, there's still an API underneath. Your API is your mechanism of distributing what your service does to people. And when something happens, like you version the API, I mean, that's a whole nother problem. But like, if there's a breaking change to the API, or there's an outage, or you change the pricing model because your business is evolving, how are you going to communicate that? Does that just mean you're going to break all of the muggles' interactions that they're mediated through AI? No. How do you enable the social interaction? Like, how do you pull the cord to escape?
I think that actually the context window is going to shrink. Because right now, the context window in which we're using APIs is an application. And that's a long-term, long-lasting, trusted context in which you can predict what people are going to do with your API. I think that is going to go to a single interaction where you have someone using an LLM saying, hey, I want to do this. And then the LLM goes looking for, okay, which API can do this? And then it starts a single session with usage.
So I think we're going to see a narrowing of what we think of as an API product too. When you have a big sort of multifaceted API that can do all kinds of things, that's great. But most of the time, your consumers are using a narrow slice of that API. And so maybe this will be a downward pressure on the size of APIs as products too. We'll see more publishing of purpose-built API products.
I was in a webinar from Superface. Like with their tool, they built basically a plugin for ChatGPT that allows you to connect to different APIs just by interacting through this chat interface. But one of the limitations they currently had was that you could only have 30 actions inside of one of these things, because that's the limitation that ChatGPT is giving. So yeah, there's still quite some work there, but it's super fascinating.
But But look at the things we were talking about earlier, the non-functional entitlements. Like if you, what is the experience, the Muggle experience? But what I mean is just the like AI facilitated API interaction when you start hitting the rate limits. Like, what are we gonna let this progressively increase? Like, how do you make people aware of their consumption patterns, prevent abuse, but also like, to me, the transition between using the API facilitated by AI or LLMs versus, like how do we make this Muggle compatible? Because we're going to run into problems.
It's a huge problem that is on the horizon, I think. I don't think anything is ready for it, because you don't want to use a traditional API key in an LLM. Right. You just don't want that, because you have no idea what they're going to do with your API.
The pattern of abuse looks very different.
Basically, you can't authorize usage.
Yeah, and look, take the flip side. What you don't want is to say to a non-developer, "Great, if you want to use this, come register on our developer portal and copy your API key into here." Like that. That's clearly a non-starter.
That also doesn't work.
But AI and LLMs are going to change so many things in interesting ways. The predictions we're making today are probably not right. We have a lot of figuring out along the way, and we don't understand it yet. Like the API consumption journey, there's such potential here, but there are a lot of big problems that we don't even know how to talk about yet.
The key thing is that there's certain assumptions, like the app context, and that is an artifact of the mobile era, basically, and that is probably going to go away. There's probably other of these current standards
the app. Why do you say the app context is going to go away?
My assumption, if I am using an artificial agent to interact with APIs, I don't want to authorize my AI agent, I don't want to authorize this application to do whatever it wants with my bank account. I want to have like in the moment authorization, like, okay, now you can go and do this. Like, hey, AI, I want you to figure out how to do X. You don't want it to just go and execute. You want to verify, like, what is it that you're going to do? I'm planning to do this. Okay, you can do that.
I hear when you're saying that is we need to rethink our consent flows. True. We need to rethink how we escalate permissions. Like, yes, I'll trust you to read my bank balance, but no, I won't trust you to make a transfer.
Yeah.
But after you've earned my trust, I might.
We have grown up in a world where there's a predetermined set of affordances that applications can use. And they're being programmed, and they're deterministic. And now we're moving into a world where you have undeterministic affordances that are going to be...
Okay, let me read back what I think I hear from you there. Because one thing I think about a lot is how Facebook used scopes with its API. So to some degree, you're right. There was a set of predetermined functionality that represents a chunk of the Facebook API that you can, from the application perspective, have permission to access. Some of those permissions are more carefully controlled, like post to timeline. But that's the like permission set that the application developer chooses. But then there is the ability to choose a subset of that using scopes that you're going to progressively offer to your users during the authorization steps. So you might say, hey, I'm not asking for your location permission now because that's a big step. But I might ask for it later. And so that gives the relationship a time, the opportunity to grow. So because we're in a three-party relationship, we've got the application developer who Facebook has a trust relationship with, and you've got the user of the application who has a level of trust that needs to be earned over time. And so I think between those two things, at least we have, it feels more flexible. And I think we just need to extend that to think about the kinds of problems that you were just touching on.
Well, but it's going to be, you're going to end up in a context where there is no affordance designer. There's nobody who's creating a predictable set of things that this thing is going to do. And actually, we are embracing unpredictableness, and that is going to change a lot of things. One of the topics you wanted to touch on, and I want to make sure that we also have a short chat about that, is OpenAPI version 4, because you're part of that elite group of people that is setting.
Well, look, I think it's a nice segue, because I think what's different, one of the clear differences between OpenAPI v3 and the opportunity we have with OpenAPI v4, which is codenamed Moonwalk. If I talk about Moonwalk, that's what I mean. Is that LLMs really changed the landscape. There's a lot of opportunity opening up here. And it, for me, clarified something that I'd sort of understood implicitly from my years with OpenAPI and Swagger for that, which is that we have these technical surfaces that need to be described. OpenAPI, that's the sort of bread and butter of what OpenAPI and Swagger before it. That's the space it lived in. But the other, just as important piece is the semantics, because this is how you explain what the specific parameter does or an operation is meant to do. You're helping people understand. This is the mapping of semantics onto that structural interface. And so if we talk about that technical contract, that is crunchy, right? What I mean is that if I'm writing code, I am giving explicit instructions for how to interpret what I want to happen, and I'm going to make mistakes with it. It's brittle, right? And that's why we have a bunch of, you have to consider your edge cases and be graceful in how you deal with problems that you weren't expected up front. Like how do you build resilient applications? So, but that's what engineering has been. It's thinking through the sort of logical, technical constraints. What LLMs enable, that's new and exciting, is to take the squishy natural language that everybody uses and be able to translate that into the crunchy. And so what I think the opportunity for OpenAPI is that you should be writing your API specifications with real attention. Like, this was always important. How you write the sort of soft metadata that's in an API spec, or actually I should say a description document like OpenAPI. How do you give the information to people so that they understand better how to use it? But now it's not just for people that you're doing this; it's for LLMs to understand the semantics of what this interface does. That's really exciting. So there's a post on the OpenAPI openapis.org blog that talks about Moonwalk and the principles that we see developing here. The first one is semantics. How do we enshrine this? This isn't just for people now. It's for people mediated through LLMs. So how do we make that semantic connection? The second piece that I'm really excited about is the concept of signatures. And the way I like to think about a signature is, if you were to observe an API request in flight, how would you know which operation it maps to in your formal description of that service? And different APIs have different ways of discriminating between those different signatures. And it used to be with OpenAPI v3, it was more opinionated. Really, there's no way to have path patterns that multipaths is really the way to think about this. That it's really a combination of the path pattern plus the HTTP method that gives you a unique operation. But sometimes there's an API design challenge, but sometimes the discriminating factor is in the query string. We have no way to represent that in OpenAPI v3. So it's meant to be more explicit about how do you think in terms of the operations that you're defining, that functionality, what is the signature mechanism you're using to discriminate between these things? So those two things I think are really exciting. And then I think, to me, Moonwalk represents, like, after we've sort of grown organically as a description format, what do we know now that we didn't before. And so I think OpenAPI has a chance to be with version 4 what it realize its true potential. I'm really excited, and there's a lot happening, and it's a welcoming open source project. So if you want to get involved, I would encourage anyone listening to do so.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the work that you're doing in the community. Creating art.
It has to be done. Like, thank you. This is a really important open source project to the API world. Having these kinds of standards matters, and it's actually surprising to me that it's not more successful or moving faster sometimes. Like this stuff needs to exist. So please come if this if this kind of thing interests you. There's lots of opportunity this year. Our goal is to publish a version 4 of the spec in 2024.
And I think that actually brings us full circle, because then we're back at like the agreements that we're making, and that are enabling us to do the enabling constraints that make it possible for us to do completely new things.
Absolutely. No, I think the bread and butter of OpenAPI has been around describing the technical contract, and it has, but applying the semantics also helps you understand some of the social contract. But that is there's opportunity for another spec, I think, that considers the non-functional entitlements and how you formally describe those. You can stuff those in using extensions, but that's not, I think, the best way. And on the other end, there's opportunity for descriptions of what APIs exist that you might use. APIs JSON is one example of this. But how do you understand a collection of possible API? I'm going to argue that there's two kinds here. There's the possible API, to use your word, utility, but like just the purely technical things that matters to people like your security team. They need to know what risks they have, and that you should know what purely technical interfaces exist. But then there's the question of how can you leverage each other's work and be a more efficient and impactful organization? And that requires the product thinking. And so I think there's a lot of interesting stuff, and I'm very bullish on API management still. So thanks for having me on today.
Thank you, Marsh. I loved our conversation again, obviously.
As always, we could talk for hours, and and I'm active on Mastodon and other places. So if people want to find me, we'll put that in the show notes, and I have a blog that I've been keeping to.
Yeah. So if people want to hear more about you, you've got a new blog that you just started.
Sociotechnical.org. I think part of figuring out what needs to happen next in terms of how we enable all of the goodness that's possible with APIs, that involves describing things like you and I have talked about today. Like, how do we get past gateway thinking and thinking about APIs as value creation? That's exciting to me. Thanks for mentioning it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure. Bye.
That's it for this episode. This episode of the Resilience Podcast was brought to you by Pronovix. You can learn more about our company at pronovix.com. And thank you for listening. And until next week.